Joseph Stalin, the Man of Stone. Gory, Georgia, late 19th century. In a shack that smells of leather and vodka lives a child who feels like a mistake of nature. Little Joseph is a smallpox survivor, but the disease has devastated his face, leaving deep scars. A carriage accident has atrophied his left arm, leaving it stiff and shorter. He feels defective, and in that brutal world, being defective means being a victim. But the real danger isn't his body, it is his father. Bessarion is an alcoholic cobbler for whom violence isn't educational, it is destructive. One night marks the definitive break. The father comes home drunk and hurls him to the ground with such violence that the child urinates blood for a week. In that week of pain, Joseph makes an unconscious decision. To survive, he must kill the part of himself that feels hurt, his weak part. He stops crying. When his father hits him, he stares him in the eyes, motionless, icy. He activates the mechanism of identification with the aggressor. If you can't defeat the monster, you must become the monster. The sensitive child dies on that floor. In his place, Stalin, the Man of Steel, is born. But violence didn't come only from the father. His mother beat him regularly too. She loved him obsessively. She wanted him to become someone, and she used beatings to force him to excel in his studies. Stalin thus learned the most dangerous lesson of all. Violence is a legitimate tool to improve people. However, it was the church that gave him the method. His mother enrolled him in the theological seminary. She wanted to make him a priest. Instead, unwittingly, she formed the greatest atheist dictator in history. Stalin himself declared years later that it was the humiliating regime and Jesuit methods of the seminary that made him a revolutionary. It wasn't a school, it was a prototype of a totalitarian state. 24-hour surveillance, cell inspections, the obligation to spy on comrades. There, among the church pews, young Stalin learned the art of perpetual suspicion and the necessity of eliminating internal traitors. Now, an adult, the proof that his cruelty wasn't political but pathological lies in how he treated his own blood, his son, Yakov. Yakov was fragile, sensitive. He represented everything Stalin had suppressed in himself. The dictator despised him openly. The psychological pressure was such that Yakov, desperate, attempted suicide by shooting himself in the chest. But he survived. When doctors informed Stalin, the father didn't run to the bedside. He made a grimace of disgust and said only, "He can't even shoot straight." The coldness became absolute during the war. The Nazis captured Yakov and proposed an exchange. Stalin's son for the German Field Marshal Paulus. Any father would have hesitated. Stalin did not. He replied with chilling logic, "I do not trade a regular soldier for a marshal." He let his son die in a Nazi concentration camp. He was doing to Yakov exactly what his father had done to him, destroying weakness without mercy. But insensitivity has a price. In March 1953, Stalin was struck by a stroke in his fortified residence. He fell to the floor, paralyzed, unable to speak. He remained there for hours, lying in his own urine exactly like that beaten child 60 years earlier. The guards heard the silence but dared not enter. He had established a climate of terror such that anyone disturbing his rest risked the firing squad. Thus, the man who had sent millions of people to die died alone, without help, killed by the very fear he had built to protect himself. Ivan the Terrible, the Beggar King. Moscow, 1538. Ivan IV is only 8 years old when his world ends. His mother, the regent, dies suddenly, likely poisoned. Without her, the court plunges into chaos, and Ivan becomes the protagonist of a cruel schizophrenia. His life splits in two. During public ceremonies, the boyars dress him in gold, seat him on the throne, and bow at his feet, calling him Great Sovereign Autocrat. But as soon as the doors close, the act ends. In private quarters, they leave him dressed in rags, often without food for days. It isn't just neglect, it is contempt. Ivan will remember for a lifetime the scene of Prince Shuisky entering his room, sprawling onto his dead father's bed with dirty boots on the royal pillows, laughing in the little Tsar's face. They stole his dead mother's jewels right before his eyes. Ivan learned the fundamental lesson of power there. The title is a fiction. Only he who has the strength to humiliate the other truly commands. In this climate of powerlessness, the first symptom of what modern criminology calls the McDonald triad appears: cruelty to animals. At 10 years old, unable to strike at the nobles yet, Ivan vents his frustration on those who are weaker. He climbs the Kremlin towers with stray dogs and cats and throws them into the void, laughing as he watches them crash. To survive, Ivan adopts a Machiavellian strategy. He pretends to be inept. While he devours history books, becoming highly educated, in front of the nobles he plays the part of the stupid boy, incapable of governing. He lets them believe they have a puppet on the throne, but meanwhile he memorizes every humiliation. The mask falls at age 13. During a meeting, with a calm that chills the blood, he orders the arrest of Prince Shaisky, the most powerful man in Russia. There is no trial. He has him mauled by hunting dogs in the courtyard. The circle closes. The dogs he once threw for fun, he now uses to kill. The nobles realize their mistake too late. The child they had starved was not incompetent. He was a predator in waiting. Once absolute power is seized, violence becomes the system. At night, he rides through Moscow, beating passers-by, and creates the Oprichnina, the secret police who rode with severed dog heads attached to their saddles, a symbol that they would sniff out and tear apart traitors. But violence is an uncontrollable drug. Ivan's paranoia became so total that he saw an enemy even in the only person he loved, his son. In 1581, the tragedy. Ivan sees his pregnant daughter-in-law dressed lightly. In a fit of bigoted fury, he beats her savagely, causing a miscarriage. His son, the Tsarevich, confronts him to defend his wife and unborn child. The Tsar loses control. He raises his iron-tipped staff and strikes his son on the temple. The prince dies 3 days later. Ivan spends those 3 days wandering the palace, screaming and scratching the walls with his fingernails until they bleed. The orphan who had pretended to be inept to survive, in the end was left truly alone, with the blood of his own son on his hands. Mao Zedong, The Art of Calculated Risk. Mao Zedong was born in 1893 in Shaoshan to a moderately well-off farming family. His father, Mao Yicheng, was a ruthless landowner and rice merchant who ran the family like a business. For Yicheng, sons were workforce. They had to produce. Mao, on the other hand, hated manual labor. He wanted to study. Yicheng despised Mao's love for reading, considering it laziness. He beat him savagely and humiliated him in front of the laborers, accusing him of consuming rice without earning it. But there was a paradox. The father despised him as a worker, yet desperately needed him as an heir. Mao, even as a child, sensed this weakness. The turning point occurred during a banquet with important guests. The father insulted Mao publicly, trying to break him with social shame. A boy in ancient Confucian China would have been expected to bow his head and endure, not Mao. He ran away from home, ran to the village pond, and stood at the edge, threatening to throw himself in. When his furious father reached him, Mao issued an ultimatum. "If you come any closer, I'll jump, and you will lose face in front of the whole village." It wasn't just a childish tantrum, it was the discovery of a lever of power. Mao realized that his father cared more about his reputation than his son's life. By putting his own total destruction on the table, Mao forced authority to negotiate. The father relented. This dynamic, the politics of calculated risk, would become the trademark of the adult Mao. At 14, his father forced him into an arranged marriage to acquire land with a girl 4 years his senior. This marriage was never accepted by Mao, who claimed to feel no affection for the girl and to have never slept with her. An act of total rebellion against tradition that marked his definitive break with paternal authority. Let's jump forward 50 years, 1966. Mao is the leader of China, but politically he is backed into a corner. The party moderates are cutting him out of command. His reaction is identical to that of the Pan, but on an imperial scale. He launches the Cultural Revolution. Historians see in this act the obsessive repetition of his childhood trauma. Mao bypasses the party, the father, and incites the students, the sons, the Red Guards, to destroy authority. He orders professors to be humiliated, forcing them to kneel on broken glass or wear dunce caps. To regain absolute power, Mao was willing to throw China into total chaos for a decade. He destroyed the economy, the school system, and the country's millennial cultural heritage. Millions of people died, many publicly tortured by students in self-criticism sessions that recalled the humiliations Mao suffered at the hands of his father. He had applied the lesson of the pond to the entire nation. Either I command, or everything sinks. Mao died in 1976, venerated as a living god. The boy who had defied his father by threatening to destroy himself had ultimately shaped an empire in his own image, where no one dared to contradict him anymore. Saddam Hussein, the Iron Bar. Tikrit, Iraq, 1937. Before he even takes his first breath, his world is already steeped in death. His father and older brother have just died. His mother, Subha, is consumed by a grief so absolute that she attempts the unthinkable, suicide, to kill herself and the child in her womb. But she is saved. And here lies one of history's sharpest ironies. The woman carrying the future fierce Arab nationalist, the man who will swear to destroy Israel, is saved by a local Jewish family. But surviving the womb only meant entering a new kind of hell. When his mother remarries, young Saddam is handed over to his stepfather, a man known locally as Hassan the Liar. Hassan doesn't just beat the boy, he constantly humiliates him. He drags him out of bed before dawn to tend to the animals, forbids him from going to school, and forces him to commit petty thefts for him. If Saddam makes a mistake or brings nothing home, he is mocked for being a worthless orphan and brutally punished. Hassan's weapon of choice is a heavy iron pipe, sometimes coated in boiling asphalt. Day after day, the iron comes crashing down on the child. But just like Stalin on the floor of his shack, Saddam makes a silent, unconscious choice. If he remains the victim, he will die. So, to survive, his mind does the only thing possible to keep from going mad. He decides to become exactly like the person beating him. He starts walking around the village always carrying an iron bar. At first, he needs it to defend himself from the other kids who tease and bully him because he doesn't have a father to protect him. But soon, that iron becomes an instrument of pure power. Saddam begins to use it to strike and even torture stray animals, taking out on them the anger he could not take out on his stepfather. As he grows older, that same bar will serve to threaten rival street gangs. The mechanism is set. The only way to never suffer terror again is to become terror itself. Years later, the boy with the iron bar trades it for the entire machinery of a state. Psychologists would later diagnose him with malignant narcissism. But beneath the military berets, the gold-plated assault rifles, and the gigantic statues, there was only a desperate attempt to hide that wounded self. It wasn't a cold, calculated strategy that drove him to use lethal gas against his own people, or to invade Kuwait, triggering a disastrous war. It was a chronic, paranoid need to demonstrate absolute strength. Behind the dictator's ruthless decisions, the survival logic of the abused child was still operating. You must always be the one to strike first, and strike mercilessly, to ensure that no one can ever hurt or humiliate you again. In the end, the illusion shattered. In December 2003, he was pulled from a dirty underground spider hole, disheveled and terrified. The dictator who had tried to forge himself in iron died at the end of a rope, finally succumbing to the violence that had birthed him. Let's be clear, a violent father isn't enough to create a monster. Millions of children go through hell and don't become Stalin. Often they become extraordinary people. To turn a broken child into a genocidal dictator takes an accomplice. History. It takes a revolution, a famine, a power vacuum to give that anger an army. Without the instability of his country, that Iraqi kid with the iron bar might have just remained a petty street thug. History is the fuel, but the spark is always there in that childhood darkness. And here we get to the question that keeps me up at night. If Stalin's father had hugged him instead of beating him, would the Gulags exist? If the nobles had protected little Ivan instead of starving and mocking him, would Russia have known that terror? Or if Mao's father had encouraged him instead of humiliating him publicly, would millions of people have suffered through the Cultural Revolution? What decides who we are? Is it DNA, biological evil? Or are we just the result of the scars inflicted upon us when we were too small to defend ourselves? Are monsters born, or are they made? I don't have the answer, but I'd love to know what you think. Let me know in the comments, because history isn't made of dates, it's made of people.